Number 2, translation as a political act, moderated by William O'Daly, the Neruda translator and the co-founder of Copper Canyon Press. I just wanted to say thank you for coming here. Thank you for allowing this experience to happen, because it's a reflection of the hearts of everybody in this room that something like this earlier panel could happen, and I'm really grateful that something like that happened. The panel is being moderated by William O'Daly, so he will take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So, let's just go down the line here. Claudia Castro has translated into Spanish poems the Vietnamese poet Nguyen Phan Quang. She is currently working on translating her own book of poems, Killing Marias, into Spanish. Into English, she has translated various individual poems from a variety of young poets writing in Spanish. Rebecca Seiferie translated Cesar Vallejo's Trilce, Sheet Metal Press, 1992. The Black Heralds, Copper Canyon, 2003. Her translations are also included in The Whole Island, 6 Decades of Cuban Poetry, University of California Press, 2009. And Reversible Monuments, Contemporary Mexican Poetry, Copper Canyon, 2001. She recently completed a manuscript of Federico Garcia Lorca's selected poems and is translating Jose Gorostiza's Muerte Sin Fin. William O'Daly, addressed him in the third person, wild in the third person, has translated poets of Mexico, Cuba, Spain, Central and South America, as well as a few ancient Chinese poets. His primary focus has been the late career and posthumous poetry of Chilean Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda. In 2017, he circled around to Neruda's beginnings, translating his first volume, Book of Twilight, originally published in 1923. All 9 of his Neruda volumes are published by, and you've heard this name a few times before, Copper Canyon Press. Sam, of course, was a prolific translator, largely from the ancient Chinese, Japanese. He also did one contemporary poet that I'm aware of, and that was Estonian poet. Jan Kaplinski, who was the education minister in Estonia. And after translating Kaplinski's poems and Kaplinski wanting Sam to translate his essays, Sam said, "No more of this contemporary shit, man. It's too limiting." In other words, he felt there was more freedom with the ancient Chinese and ancient Japanese. Whether that's true or not, I think it's a different sort of freedom. But we originally, in 1972, were invited by Kenneth Rexroth to take his world poetry class at UC Santa Barbara. And Rexroth, of course, was a prolific translator from many languages, 7 languages, last I counted. And he said, you know, you all need to translate. You all need to translate. It'll broaden your sensibility. It'll broaden your scope. You'll get out of yourself and into the mind and heart of a master. You know, we usually translate those who we greatly admire. And it'll do a world of good for your own poetry. And you'll see yourself in a way you've never seen yourself before. More importantly, getting outside your own language, you'll hear yourself in a way you've never heard yourself before. A lot like you leave your hometown, you come back, and then you really see what your hometown is. If you never leave your hometown, it's almost impossible to know it. So with that prologue, maybe Claudia could share oh, and let me do this. To set the stage for our three panelists. This is literary translation is a political act to colonize or recreate. Literary translators do not simply translate the literal surface of a poem. They strive to embody the human experience, sensibility, and sinew of the original within the translation. To accomplish this, they must retain the integrity of their self-awareness, imagination, sensibility, and language as they actively lend those qualities to the original. This willful act of transmigration, including the host of choices translators must make, has political ramifications. The panel will explore how the translator can avoid colonizing the original poem in favor of recreating the fullest experience of it in a new body. What's that? I'm so sorry. I feel like standing. I'm so sorry. You know, he stands on stages. I'm so
the invisible guy. I had a beard last time.
Oh, that's it. My apologies, Ian. I will get it together. I will become over here soon. Ian Boyden, the guy down at the end. Artist, writer, translator, and curator, investigates relationships between the self and the environment. In particular, how art and writing can shape our ecology. For several years, he has worked with artists and writers in Chinese dissident community. In 2018, he received a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Translation Fellowship to translate the poetry of the Tibetan writer, humanist, and political dissident Seiferie. And he did a fabulous presentation yesterday. The book, he's also, his visual art is stunning. And he has 11 copies of a book that is even hard to pick up. Beautiful paintings, poems by Sam. It's absolutely gorgeous. Maybe you give a larger presentation at some point. Yeah. That would be good. So, thank you.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you so much. And what an honor and a pleasure. So at the risk of forgetting things, I prepared a very quick response to that idea of to colonize or recreate is the question there that I'm trying to not necessarily answer, but somehow mull over, to consider. And then in light of what was just said, I have, of course, new thoughts that have. So, unless the translator has a deliberate ideological agenda before encountering what it is to be translated, I think translation of poetic works is neither a recreation nor a colonization, but rather an interpretation. In terms of colonization, the social historical location of the translator vis-a-vis the work being translated is a primordial consideration, as we are each products of our class, historical, and cultural attachments. A good translator needs to be aware of her location as well as that of the poet being translated. This awareness should be basic preparation. Not having it is a serious shortcoming before the work has even begun. But in the wide range of considerations, I would rather see attempts at translation than not attempts at all. With respect to recreation, it's impossible to have a literal translation of someone else's work. even that of one's own work, for that matter. For each language has a logic and spirit of its own. Languages are composed of intangible variations on the human condition. The translator's job is to consider the entire thrust of the poem before engaging in the actual translation of the words themselves. The sensibility of the translator considers the sensibilities of the poet: voice, diction, imagery, sound, form, myth, metaphor. The poet translated her own poem from the depths of her heart and mind. In other words, the writing act itself is a sort of a translation, is what I'm saying here. The poet translated her own poem from the depths of her heart and mind. The original poem is itself a translation from the nonverbal, pre-word to words, pre-word to form and symbol. The rich ambiguity that poets seek in their compositions, that is part and parcel of the craft of poetry, then adds even more complexity to those doing the translating's task. I find that literal translations word by word seldom work as well as those where a negotiation has taken place between the original text and the authorial interpretation. Words each have their own resonance. In between them, as they are arranged on a line, there is a valence the translator must consider. It is a narrow margin, a thin perimeter around each word, but a space nonetheless. I find that a more honest stance, one of interpretation rather than translation, is more valuable because it allows for the acknowledgement of the translator's craft, which when done well is immense. So I'll stop there in the remarks that I prepared, but I have to say that any act of translation is a political act because we are so embedded in a socio-historical grid as individuals that we have to respond to just as much as the writer was embedded in their own time and space in the same way. And so it's political in many ways, but it starts with that. It starts with the location of where the translator is with respect to the work being translated and that of the writer who wrote that original text. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill and Claudia. I was reminded listening to Claudia's remarks. I think it was George Steinhardt who said that all poets are translators. And for me, I think actually, I began as a translator when I was about 6 years old. My parents did not get along at all. Very different people. So they'd have these extended arguments and seat me at the kitchen table between the two of them. My father would say something, look at me. I would turn to my mother and say, Mom, Dad just said this. Then he would say something, she would say something, and I'd say, Dad, Mom just said this. So that would go on for an hour or two. The thing is, they were both speaking English. Both of them knew no other language. And so part of when I became a poet was the sense of trying to write about an experience and realizing that I had learned everyone's language but my own. That I didn't know how to articulate any of the deeper layers, the complexities of my own experience. So becoming a translator, I think, was sort of inevitable from the intersection of those things. And it was for me deeply bound up in this awareness that the word is also a wound, that it has this expression of power, that every word in English if you go back to its root, there's kind of extended history within one word, and it is often a history of oppression. So to speak, to try and articulate one's own experiences in this present moment, is to always try and articulate out of that whole bedrock of what hasn't been said, what hasn't been articulated, and also the oppression and the history that is woven in the language and its limitations. So for me, translating is, in a sense, always being aware that, as Claudia noted, I'm of a particular place, a particular time, with all of these assumptions, biases, ancestral inheritances, and that there is a way in which I try to become more aware of those. So translation is a kind of process of subverting what I think I know. So, and there are different ways to do that. In the cases of some poems that I've read often in translation for a long period of time, I found that at one point, the easiest way to disrupt what I thought I knew, what I remembered, was to run a poem through a bad Google translating process 3 times, 4 times. And what that would do was start to disrupt my sort of, that kind of autopilot. I think I know this. I know this song. I've heard it. I've memorized it. And also going back always to the root of every word, even the simplest word. Looking through the dictionaries, through an article, even though I know that word, because in a sense that returns me to my own experience of language, that sense of those complex layers of experience that is inarticulate. So it returns me in the process of translating to that deep sense of being at the edge of language. How do we speak what we have not spoken before? How do we utter the word we do not have? And so translation is very much related to poetry for me in terms of returning to that sense of mystery, possibilities, and a sense of what one does not know. And I think it's true that there's this way in which you have to have, as Claudia noted, this sense of the whole poem, not just in a sort of segmented version of what each particular word translates to. And that sense is, I think, part of what makes translators, or at least many of them, gravitate towards certain writers. Most of the writers I've translated have been ones that I've read for years, sometimes decades, in the original, read translations, and then wanted to write about their work, maybe critically, or refer to something, and realized I had to translate it, because the sense that I have of the whole that I felt in a particular work was not there in the existing translation. Thank you.
translation as a political act. This is something which, for me, came directly from Sam. And so I thought that for those of you who are out there who spent those nights that Thomas described, either listening to George Jones or ending up with some sort of serious delivery of Sam koan, on the nights when you got the koan, for me, it was usually him talking about Camus. And he would end by saying, you can either be a murderer, an accomplice of murderers, or you can resist with your entire being. And then he'd stare at me for a while. What are you going to do? You know, I mean, the answer seems really freaking clear. You know, you're going to resist. But how are you going to do that? And in Camus' book, Neither Victims Nor Executioners, which is what that's from, this is a set of essays that he wrote right after the war and during the war. He said that the only honorable course is to believe firmly that words are more powerful than munitions. And Sam would never say that last part, which I always thought was really interesting. He'd leave that off. And I think that for him that was a very powerful koan that he arrived at inside of Camus' writing. And I think that it fueled a lot of what he did, a lot of the ways in which he approached his own poetry, approached his translation. When I began to think about how I would apply that to my own life and my own set of skills, I became more and more interested in the possibility that translation, the gift that I could give through translation was not to translate ancient poets. I've done quite a lot of that, but that what could be far more powerful for me, at least meaningful for me, would be to translate someone who's alive. And I think that translators, oftentimes we sit around and we wait for that, whatever that cultural body is, to shake the blanket and shake the blanket and shake the blanket until there's just a few pieces of writing left that are theoretically the very best. They're the canon, and then you begin to translate those particular people. And oftentimes the reality that they are writing out of has simply passed. Those wars are gone, the conflicts have died, someone has won, someone has lost, dignity has been stripped. All the things that might impel someone to write, those conditions have really shifted. And I think that's the nature of things. Not that we can't learn from those when we translate those into another culture, time, and language. But I decided that I would try to do something very different. And I think it's interesting you brought up Keklinski because Sam would never talk about him. He loved to talk to me about Isa and Dufu and Basho and all these people that have been dead for hundreds of years. And I think there's a real beauty to being able to give yourself to an ancient voice. I think that Sam's translations of Isa, for instance, are filled with more compassion than any of the other translators that are out there. If you compare Sam's translations of Isa with Robert Haas's, you'll find two totally different Isas that are there. I'm just going to read one of those because it struck me as someone was saying something here. My brain is so frazzled right now that I apologize, I don't remember who it was. In the midst of this world, we stroll along the roof of hell, gawking at flowers. That's Sam Hamill, right there, who's translating a literary translation of Isa, and I think bringing him completely into the world at the present moment. But if you can't hear Sam fully inside of that, then you really haven't read Sam's poetry. So what I did is I began to look at contemporary Chinese dissident poets, and became really interested in a poet named Seiferie, who's a Tibetan poet. She was born during the Cultural Revolution, and at age 7 she had to start studying Chinese. She was forced to study Chinese in Chinese schools, very much like what happened in the United States with different native groups being re-educated, literally having your entire cultural system rewritten by a colonial power. And so Wozer is a person who's writing directly out of that experience, which is happening right now. It's been going on for 60 years in Tibet. And so the act of writing poetry for her is an act of resisting colonialism and trying to make sense of that experience and what that means. And for me, as a translator of that work, I think it's really interesting to wonder how much of that is a colonial act. Is a question that I really hadn't thought about until Bill sent me that. Because what we're dealing with is, we're kind of like a forest. We're all here speaking English, and the reason we're all speaking English is because this is the language of the vast colonial expansion across this country. And for those of you who are speaking Spanish in this room, you're speaking Spanish because it's the remnant, it's this giant forest that's just stretched out across the world through a colonial act. And Chinese is now this gigantic colonial language as well, which has swept across East Asia. And I really wonder, to what degree is a language colonial at its heart, and to what degree is that, something which is reflected just by the politics of that particular time. So those are issues that I deal with a lot as I translate. I'm just going to end my comments by reading one of Wozer's poems, so we have that here. And this is a poem which is called Revolutionary Fire. I was born into this world dread like a hurricane from Beijing, engulfing Lhasa in the violent winds of reform. I only remember the changes, the alienation under a red flag, how I could only become one of them as I grew up in the schism. Not only do I remember how the fires ignited by that hurricane burned, nor the sequence of their burning, I also have no memory of the earlier revolutionary fires. The burning was not limited to one place, it was everywhere. Each curling flame opens into an interminable blank space, another hellish lacuna in the pages of history. Through these chasms of raging fire, I see the Norbalinka on March 17th, 1959. I see the Potala Palace on March 10th, 1959. I see tears overflowing, the anguish over the violent death of my relatives and my people, the grief of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, as he fled in the middle of the night. I grieve. Each day the losses become greater, as does my sense of impotence to bring any of this back. Even the vultures, who are not of this godless world, covered their faces and took flight. It was declared that sky burials were part of the four olds, accustomed to be eradicated. The corpses, piled for years upon the sky burial platforms overlooking the Sera Monastery, immediately disappeared. I think that when we translate work from another language that's about something which is happening right at this very time, one of the things that we don't get is to take the time to sort of play around with language and the myriad possibilities of what the author might have been thinking about. And in my case, I had the amazing opportunity to actually talk with the poet herself about these pieces. And it goes directly directly to something that Claudia touched upon, and that is that when you're translating a poem, one of the most revolutionary things that you can do inside of that is to go back to the original source from which that poem generated. This is that pre-verbal realm, that pool of meaning from which that poem sprung from. And you have to do that if you're going to translate that poem in a way that carries the urgency and that sense of sort of a vibrant urgency that's so essential for it to have any form of meaning. So I'll be happy to field questions about that as we go forward.
To all three panelists and their statements, yes. On Thursday night, I opened my reading talk about the origins of Copper Canyon with a poem, the first poem in the first book of Pablo Neruda. I'd like to read that again, but before I start, I would like to thank the Zen panel for articulating the struggles that I had through my 48 years of close friendship with Sam. I would say the best way I could put it was that Sam was a koan. And in my relationships with him, which were overwhelmingly beneficial, I discovered a lot about myself. I discovered I took stands, very firm stands, with a gentleman who could be extremely persuasive. And also I felt a kinship. We were such different people, and yet from very different places, very different locations, both in the spirit and physically. And yet we found a commonality in so many values that it was startling. How we acted on those values probably varied, I know it did. How we lived them out, for better or worse, who can say, except in specific situations that were sometimes really wonderful and inspirational, and other times devastating. But that friendship for me was always trying to triangulate this other entity, this thing that we shared, the differences and the commonalities. That was an act of translation, a continual act of translation. There was attempts at colonization. There was definitely lots of interpretation, and there was a ton of recreation. As we created ourselves, people say, you've got to find yourself. Find yourself. Well, I'm right here, whatever I am. I look at more, Seamus Haney also is very articulate about this. We don't find ourselves, we create ourselves. Every hour, every day, every month, every year. And on that note, and please, I ask Claudia's forgiveness. Anyone who has Spanish as a first language, having it as a second language, will read this poem in Spanish first, or whatever it turns out to be. Inicial. He ido bajo Helios, que me mira sangrante, labrando en silencio mis jardines ausentes. Mi voz será la misma del sembrador que cante, cuando bote a los surcos siembras de pulpa ardiente. Cierro los labios, pero en rosas tremantes, desata mi voz, como el agua en la fuente. Que si no son pomposas, que si no son fragrantes, son las primeras rosas, hermano caminante, de mi desconsolado jardín adolescente. Helios is the sun god. Beginning. Emerging under Helios, who sees me bleed, I labor silently in my absent gardens. My voice will be that of the sower of seed who sings as he casts among the sowed furrows of burning pulp. I close my lips, but in trembling roses my voice breaks loose like water in the fountain. If they're not pompous, if they're not fragrant, they're the first roses, fellow traveler, of my inconsolable adolescent garden. My inconsolable adolescent garden, I became aware of it, let's put it that way, at age 18, 19, when I first picked up a book of Neruda's to translate. And then that was what the beginning of a practice, because I didn't have the chops, but I knew one thing was for sure. The translator who had translated the Residencia en la Tierra, 3 volumes, had no ear. And this beautiful music of Neruda's was lost. And there was this kind of literal surface. And I come from a Mexican blood, Irish, Mexican, and Italian. What a mess. So I heard my grandparents speak Spanish when they didn't want me to understand what it was they were saying, which of course I became very interested, and I loved the music of the language. So this translation was an abomination to me, being 19 and self-righteous. What have you done? So I started translating and realized I don't have the chops for this. But I did it anyway. Picked it up, put it down, picked it up, put it down. I related the story of Rexroth. When Sam and I would get together in those UCSB nights and read poems to each other, often they were poems in translation. And I rarely use the word translation by itself. They're poems in translation. And it was this huge swath of poets, a lot of the Greek poets, which informed our sense of poetry as a political act. So, skipping ahead, after co-founding Copper Canyon Press and moving back to California, I was living in Modesto, and I went to study with Philip Levine in Fresno. And Philip Levine at that point was translated. He had translated Gloria Fuertes. He was translated Jaime Sabines, and working with Ernesto Trejo, a young Mexican-American poet who died way too young. And these were turning out beautifully. And he said to us in workshop one day, "You young poets, you're so full of yourselves. Translate. In fact, next workshop, don't bring one of your own poems. Bring a poem in translation. If you don't know another language, go pick up a dictionary. Find a poem, a poet that inspires you. Bring me a translation." So I walked in the Stanislaus County Library in Modesto, went to the Spanish language section, and there was this very thin book of Neruda's. Of course, by that time, I thought I knew all of Neruda, all of his books. But there were 14 late and posthumous books that somehow had slipped by me. And I picked up Aum and took it home, opened the book, and I thought, well, I might as well translate the first poem and start at the beginning. And there were the first 5 words, "Hoy es el día más." Oh, shit. What am I going to do with this? Sure, hoy, today, is el día, the day. Mas. So I wrote down in my notebook with a little, this is pre-smiley faces, pre-emojis, an emoji, like smiling. Today is the day with the mostest. And my first thought was, I'm going to fail at this. I'm going to fail real good. So I kept going and brought it to class. I don't remember how I know I had left the line like that. I don't remember how I had translated it for class. But it was 7 years later, just as Farrar, Straus, and Giroux finally got back to me, who owned all the North American rights to Neruda, and said, Mr. Rodale, your translation of Aun, Still Another Day, not terribly literal, but the book, the context of the book led me to that, is very, very fine, and we do not intend to publish it. So there was Sam. We early in Copper Canyon, we were surviving on Kraft macaroni and cheese, the solidified in the pan version. And so we really couldn't pay for translation rights and deal with that complexity. So that was the first book of translation that Copper Canyon published 6 more in the first, between then and 84 and 91. And it transformed the press. And that's how Tree Swenson puts it. It transformed the press in almost every way. And they became a fabulous publisher of translation. I think how I want to link this to, I can't get over that. Excuse me if I'm stuttering, I can't get over that Zen panel. I kept thinking about translation, my relationship with Sam, and the incredible gift he gave with his translations, with the press, as well as Tree Swenson. And to me. And what he gave me, essentially by giving me this forum, was giving me my own poetry. It transformed my poetry like you can't believe. And people kept saying, sometimes I like your translation, or your poems better than your translations of Neruda. And I was saying, oh, go on. But what was really interesting is that, again, this translation is very, very much like the writing of poetry. When you're writing your poems, you're responding to experience. The way you hear it, the way you feel it, all your senses hopefully are attuned, and you're bringing it into this you're transmigrating this experience into language. With a translation, responding, at least let me speak for myself. I've learned after all these years that what I do when I look at a poem I'm going to translate is sense it every way I can. It essentially is another experience. It's not just a poem, it's not just the body it's in. It is an experience unto itself. And so you have to respond to it the way you respond to any other experience, as fully as possible if you're going to be creating poetry. And so that brought me to an understanding of translation that I would describe, and I think it's been stated in slightly different ways by the panelists. We translate each other. George Steiner has this wonderful meme in After Babel where he says, and I think I'll get it close to right. Before the fall, men and women spoke the same tongue, comprehending each other's meaning perfectly. After the fall, speech divided them. And there's this, I just just cracked up when I read this, But I also had the benefit of reading Deborah Tannen, who spent a good part of their first 15 years of her scholarly life examining how men and women use language differently. And it was so, I can't tell you what this did for my relationships with women, because I learned a lot about how I use language just in an everyday way. I began to understand the women who were very close to me much better in terms of what they were telling me beyond the words. And so the whole point is to make us whole. There's a kind of religio there. There's a binding force. And that's one of the great political acts of translation. There is the choice whether to colonize a poem, make it your own, twist it, make it what you want it to be. We do this with experience all the time. We see it the way we see it, often the way we want to see it. But that's not the way to translate. And Rebecca was eloquently thinking about how we break down those habitual ways of seeing in ourselves, or how we have to do that when we go to translate. I know too many poets who have colonized too many other poets. And I would say most of the translators who I've interacted with and who I've read have done their very best to, let's call it, recreate by way of interpretation that poem. So you have what you have, and I'll end with this. You have the quote-unquote original, which is not original, that has been developed, who knows by how many forces, much like a rock is formed by water and wind. The poet did not create that with vacuum. You have your interpretation of the translation, your experience of it, and you do your best to be what we call faithful to that. And what you hope to create, in my mind, are fraternal twins. There's no such thing as identical twins. There are no clones in poetry. Well, you translate, that must be very difficult, but you know it's impossible, don't you? And I say, no, I don't. Because my expectation is, no, I will not be cloning the original poem. I'll be doing my best to have a relationship with that poem that is true, honest, honorable, and respectful. And I'll give it my best shot and hope it turns out. So. Now, I'd like to get the audience involved, and we'll take questions. You can either direct your question at one of the panelists or myself.
Sam, when he came to that, he could really not speak Japanese. And I thought, how is this guy who doesn't speak Japanese, doesn't know Japanese, except just, a little bit of the basics, how can he translate these amazing poets like Issa, Basho, Yokana? And I must have been some of these questions for Ian. And so, we talked about this, and he said, yeah, well, I don't understand Japanese all that well, I don't understand ancient Chinese all that well, but I get scholars to help me. And then I find the inherent song in the original language, and then I look at poetry as being essentially song, something that's delivered in the mouth, whether it's to melody or not, delivered not through the page, not through the written word, but through the vocal, through the body. And ever since then, I changed my style of translation, realizing that you had to take a more personal approach to your own experience in the translation. So before that I was slavishly translating Japanese, thinking I have to be totally clear with the original intent of the Japanese, the original inflection, the original syntax. And that makes it very stilted English. So he changed my whole view on how to translate, especially if you're doing literary translation. My question in the end, in doing contemporary Chinese poetry, how much latitude do you take? English and Chinese are so different. And how do you get the song quality of Chinese to come into English? And how do you deal with that? How do you think about that philosophy on that?
I think that, is this about the right distance? I think that this is it's really an important question. It's a really complex question because each translator is going to arrive at that, at the language with their own set of proclivities, obviously. And that poem that they're approaching, the poet that they're approaching is also going to be existing in a specific time and place. With Sam, he translated from Japanese and Chinese, and really didn't know either one of those languages very well, and certainly didn't know classical Chinese or classical Japanese or the Buddhist classical Chinese Buddhism, which was being used widely in Japan. These are really multiple facets of language that are there, and yet he had informants, he had people like you who were, I think, really, really great at helping him grasp who those poets were. So there's, I think, oftentimes, especially when you're looking at translations of ancient poetry, you can see certain progressions. That we start off with very literal translations, and people who are really interested in just getting the linguistic precision and exact meaning of those original pieces, and they might be pretty awkward. Like reading it, it's kind of like, what the hell? Like this doesn't sound very good. And then it begins to progress. And if you look at Sam's translations of ancient Chinese, there aren't a lot of them that exist that are purely him alone. Almost all of the translations that I know of his are from bodies of poetry that have been translated many, many, many times. And you can, if you go and study that whole body of translation, you can usually figure out the lineage that Sam was following to arrive at his own voice. I think that's really fascinating. It's a really interesting thing to see how translation itself has its own set of lineages that begin to exist in another language, so that you can arrive, hopefully, at some point where you have a poem in that second language, which has somehow captured that energy and that overflowing spirit that the original had. That piece that I read of Issa's is one that I think he really did that. He finally got there. Sam was the guy who was able to, through his particular set of studies of Buddhism and his capacity to empathize on poetic levels, which I think is a really great subject for a panel at some point, because I think he had an amazing skill there. I was able to accomplish. In my own work, the person that I'm translating, Chinese is her second language, so she and I are actually speaking to each other in Chinese, both as our second languages. And I think that has allowed for a certain form of freedom for both of us that is very hard to describe. But when you're speaking your own language, it's really easy to get lost in your own thoughts. Because the progression of ideas seems so, A to B to C to D to E, it's so obvious where you're going to go that you can leap to E, right? And you can pass over all the thought that you were going to have to arrive at that place. But when you're speaking a second language, oftentimes you don't have that luxury to do that. And so the conversations become very direct, and you ask extremely direct questions. And I think that in many respects, her poetry also addresses things very directly because of it. So her voice her poems are not sung. they're not chanted. She's a very open verse type of poet in there, so I don't have to worry all that much about trying to retain some sort of formal relationship to that original verse. I don't know if I've answered that question he's asking.
Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to clarify to you the Tibetan poet you're translating, is she writing in Tibetan?
No, she writes in Chinese. So as a young girl at age 7, she was put into Chinese schools and forced to speak a foreign tongue.
I just didn't know if she had learned her original, relearned her original.
Oh yeah, she also speaks Tibetan, but she writes in Chinese.
It should be noted that this is a venerable tradition. Translators like W.S. Merwin have often relied on what we call most often, either cribs, which is another translation of the poem, or a literal rendition that someone has created for the translator to use to make the translation. Or an informant. Sam did Jan Kaplinski's book, those poems, with Rena Tan, whose first language is Estonian. I rely on editors. Catch me if you can, please. Where have I gone wrong, or where you disagree? And then what I do, and I'm sure this is true of most other translators, is make the decisions and own it. And a lot of that comes down to the inner ear, balancing the inner ear. What sounds the truest? What feels the truest? What sounds the truest? I've done a minuscule amount of ancient Chinese, translation from ancient Chinese. Believe me, I used an informant. And it was a co-authored mine, the Chinese gentleman Han Ping Chen, who defected to this country in the mid-70s. We spent 15 years writing a historical novel based in the Cultural Revolution in China. And per the Chinese tradition of what we call novels, we included some poems. And so I got to translate those. And there's one poem, plum blossoms are falling. Okay. Well, according to Han Ping, and I have reason to believe this, I did my research, there were 47 possibilities for what this image represented. Depending on its context, largely its context, both musically, tonally, of course, and in terms of the situation of the poem. And what it meant in this poem was fallen scholars. Scholars who had fallen because they had been felled, because they had stuck to their beliefs, were honorable, and whose view of the world and how they communicated that could not be bent by any authority.
I think Rebecca's holding the mic. If we could give her and Claudia the last word on this, I think we're ready to wrap it up. Well, go ahead, ask the question and then the comments and then we'll call it.
Okay.
This is very good, actually. I think, one, I'd love to hear talking more about your work with young people and transition that you're doing. And also, how does that connect with that Christian when you talk about using Google Translate? How do you see the digital age impacting translation?
Yeah.
Sure. I think Google Translate is helpful with colloquial communication. I spent time in Germany and studied German in Germany, and I'm a very capable German speaker. And but I often, in writing email and mostly email because nobody writes letters anymore once Christmas time or something. I use Google Translate just to double check certain things for myself, and sometimes it's useful, but unless you have a very good working knowledge of that language, I don't think it's helpful at all. It's very misleading, and it's the same thing for Spanish. So I mean, unless it's for a very colloquial thing, I wouldn't rely on it for especially something like literary translation, you know, because it's very literal. That's the problem with it. It has no nuance, I find, the Google stuff, and it's very firmly has this limits around what this language is doing, and it's very mechanical in what it spews back to you. With respect to youth, I have done poetry workshops in Spanish in Seattle, and so my teaching is in Spanish, and I get the youth to write in Spanish, and then often we do recordings, and I've done some publishing of their work, and then I work with the youth with the English because they also have a working knowledge of English, many of them do, and so it's in collaboration with them, which is an advantage that when you're translating, you know, writers who are dead or century years, you know, who wrote centuries ago, you can have that collaboration. So having a collaboration, my work with Mai also has been one of collaboration where I'm translating her work into Spanish, but I bring her up and say, here, let's talk about this particular, you know, phrase or something. So I think that is a very different, you know, you translating Vallejo, that's an entirely different set of circumstances. So.
Yeah, that's true. It's very different when you can call up the poet, the original author, and ask. In that sense, when you can't ask, you can always read more deeply into their essays, their writings on other topics. For instance, with Vallejo, there was an essay which hadn't been translated very much, in which he was talking about the thread of indigenous blood in reference to his own work and his own awareness, because his family was of mixed ancestry. Supposedly his two grandfathers were Spanish priests, and his two grandmothers were Native women. And some of his first neologisms he created in Quechua. So there's this way in which you can read more deeply into everything else that the writer might have written, essays, letters, correspondence, because you can begin to feel and be more aware of where they were in their particular time and where they were coming from in terms of these meanings or words that you're trying to translate and where you might have a question. So you're, in a sense, trying to know them more deeply through this sort of correspondence. I think Google Translate, though, can be quite helpful. I've taught translation workshops where people have come in, never done a translation, know no other language, and they just start. And one way they start is by reading various, multiple translations of one poem. Because as they read, let's say, 15 versions of one poem, they begin to see these different possibilities, but they also, after a time, begin to hear the original sort of rising like a ghost or a spirit between all these versions. And so they can begin there by using different translators on the internet that generate different versions combined with different translations. And it's partly a way of feeling their own way into their own language, but also into an awareness of the poet that they're translating. So, and also with children, I think as poet laureate in Tucson and then Poets in the Schools program long ago in Mexico, I often had workshops where children were bilingual, speaking Spanish first, just learning English, kindergartners. So I think in that case, I found that what really had this incredible results was both languages, all languages are equal. So with the kindergartners, where no one could write, I could have them make pictures and color them of their poems and then go around to be their secretary. And so I said, tell me whatever you want me to write. And I did, like whether it was in Spanish, English, and some occasions today. And for them, that was a great experience. And one of the examples I always remember is there was this one boy, about 5, his name was Alonso. And his teacher came up to me several days after this workshop, and while it's still ongoing. And she said, I need to talk with you about Alonso. I said, well, okay, what's, why? And she's like, well, he doesn't speak English. I said, oh, I have something to show you. So I took her over to the students' papers, and he had written a whole heap of poems that were in English, Spanish, and English, primarily Spanish, but just a bit of English. So in that approach, in the writing in those languages as he knew them, it had given him all of these possibilities for expression that evidently he had been keeping secret from his teacher.
So I, as Poet Laureate of Washington State, this is my second year that I've distributed poetry and translation cards through independent booksellers in Washington State. And this year they went to, I think, 26 different books. But I brought some of these cards for you, and I'll put them in the back. And it is a poem. This year, the cards look like this, like a plain card. It says Poesía para Todos, poetry for everyone. And in the back is a poem written by a 9th grader whom Raul taught at Evergreen High School. So this poem emerged from his teaching. And I just want to read it very quickly. It's a very short poem. First, she wrote it in Spanish, and then it also has the translation. And I'm doing this as this idea that all languages are languages. So they have parody as well. So, mi carga. Algunas memorias nunca se van de tus huesos, como la sal del mar se convierte parte de ti y lo cargas. My load. Some memories never leave your bones. Like the salt in the sea, they become part of you, and you carry them. And that is Yareli Lopez Martinez. And I'll put the little cards in the back for you.
Before we let them go, I just want to say that the idea to create this anthology, which will be launched tonight at 7, the idea to do panels on Zen and translation, and the idea, and actually the picture of Sam and the graphics are all provided by this guy right here. The inspiration, the graphics. So his poetry side is only one small part of his incredible artistry and consciousness. So I'm very grateful. I'm reminded of being in a restaurant in Beijing, a Western restaurant, and seeing on the dessert list, and I should have eaten it, but I didn't, a dish called Crispy Pimp. And Dennis explained to me how it got that way, and I'll let you listen to that, but translation is important. And then my mom said, oh, you mean chulo tostado? And I said, okay, now we got it in Spanish. So, what an incredible couple of panels. Please give these people a